Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this glorious day that we have to enjoy. Be with those and comfort those that are unable to enjoy it. Let this be some joy and brightness in their life. I ask that you be with all of us as we go through this week. Keep us safe and keep us focused on you. In your name we pray. Amen. And this morning, we are honored, blessed, whatever, something like that, to have Herb Brownett, one of our own, one of our several historian types in the group, which is very good because they take over the podium from time to time to tell us very interesting things and varied things. Herb's going to talk to us about the U-boat. He'll tell us about that. And you might wonder why this pump is here. That's an artifact. That's how you get air into a submarine. So, you know, I had to fix a wheel on the cart that had a flat tire, so I brought that in with me. But with that, Herb, I'll pass the microphone and the PowerPoint to you.
All right.
Looking forward to hearing all about U-505.
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here on a beautiful spring day. You must be interested in the topic. And I always enjoy making these presentations. I try to do one a year, usually in the spring. I also want to thank Dave and the group for having me back. Today's presentation is a continuation of a series that I've been doing on World War II. That's one of my many areas of historical interest. Oops, don't hit buttons with your notes. Okay. And they're primarily based on places or things that I've visited. This one does hark back to all three. I did one on D-Day, one on Bletchley Park, one on World War II logistics. Somewhere along the way, I snuck in Henry Flagler in my home state of Florida. But anyway, so this is a continuation. My interest in World War II submarines actually started when I was a teenager. I read the novel Run Silent, Run Deep, and got interested in the American side of submarine warfare. In the Pacific, there's a lot of books, great history books written by submarine captains, admirals, so on and so on. And then, but in 1981, the movie Das Boot came out, which was one of the first really gritty, this is the way it really was, World War II movies. How many people have seen that movie? Okay, a lot of you, okay. And from all my reading, I actually read the book, which is real thick, and of course has a lot more detail than a movie, but that's a pretty accurate representation of what was pretty tough duty. So I have visited the U-505 twice. I'll get into that later. Once outside and once inside. Inside being a much more pleasant experience. It is a fascinating World War II relic. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just to give background to the story to talk about the Battle of the Atlantic. It was the longest sustained military campaign in World War II, and in effect lasted from the very day the war started to almost the day the war ended. Winston Churchill famously said after the war, the only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat barrel. And there's good reason for that. England, UK is an island nation. The only resource they're rich in is coal. They have to import food and just about all the other materials you need for war. And the Germans, actually, they attempted in World War I to figure that if you could isolate England from its supplies, it couldn't continue to fight. And that is, in fact, true. One of the more interesting what ifs of World War II is, you know, what ifs like, what if Hitler had declared war on the U.S. and what if he had invaded Russia and what if the Japanese, you know, had alerted Pearl Harbor, you know, stuff like that. Anyway, one of the more interesting ones was in the pre-war armament buildup, Hitler, like just about everybody in the world, was enamored with big battleships, big capital ships, which everybody quickly found out were obsolete once the war started. But he built Bismarck, the Tirpitz, the Starnhorst, however you say it. Anyway, the Bismarck famously sank one ship, the Hood, and was sunk itself. The Tirpitz was bottled up for the whole war and finally sunk by bombers. And so those ships that were designed to raid Atlantic commerce weren't really very effective. So here's the what if. What if instead of building those battleships, they had taken those resources and built submarines and had a lot more U-boats at the start of the war? And there's a lot of people think that if they had done that, they could have forced the UK, England into submission, but they didn't. Okay, so just highlights of the Battle of the Atlantic. As I said, it started in 1939 with the start of the war. The Allies were not prepared for submarine warfare. In 1940, France fell, and the Germans were able to establish U-boat bases of operations on the west coast of France, Florence, Saint-Lazare, Brest, and a few other places. And then in 1939, which was only a few months, they sank 114 Allied ships. After the fall of France in mid-1940, they sank 471. And then at Pearl Harbor, late 1941, 1942, the U.S. is in the war. Now they can really get to work because they had to be careful about sinking U.S. ships. And now anything going to England was fair game. And in 1942, they sank 1,160 Allied warships, which was getting to be critical. 1943 was the inflection point. And I'll talk about what changed here in a minute. In May of 1943, there were 240 operational warships at sea, 240 operational U-boats, 118 were at sea, 41 were destroyed in 1 month. And so Admiral Donitz, who commanded the submarines, pulled the submarines back from the mid-Atlantic and focused on the coastal areas around Africa, the Bay of Biscay, the approaches to England and everything. So that was, and in 1943, the ships, we lost 377. And in 1944, they lost the French ports as we overran France, and it dropped to 132. And in the last year, they only did 56. But over the time that they were in action, they sank 2,300 ships, 13 million tons of cargo, food for England, war materials, airplanes, tanks, fortunately not many troop ships. And so it was very dangerous. There were 785 U-boats destroyed out of 1,162 built. That's a 68% casualty rate. As you can imagine, in general, when a U-boat is sunk, the whole crew is lost. And so they had the highest casualty percentage rate of any branch of the German armed forces. I will mention that the U.S. submarine force had the highest casualty percentage rate of any of the U.S. armed forces. Okay, much higher than the Marine Corps. A close second was the 8th Air Force bombers. And if you've watched Masters of the Air on Apple TV, which is on right now, I highly recommend it. It's really, really good. So, what turned the tide? Well, this is going to hark back to last year's presentation, and those of you who are here, you're going to see a few slides. There are a few things you saw last year, so consider it a review. For everybody else, it's new. So there were 3 things: resources, tactics, and technology. Now, in terms of resources, you heard me talk last year about how we could build a Liberty ship in 39 days. We got to where we could build ships faster than they could sink them. Okay. And they would assemble these huge convoys. So even though the U-boats could attach the convoys, there were so many ships, a lot of them were going to get through. And they had a lot more escorts. The second thing was tactics. And the main change in the tactics was the greatest enemy of World War II submarines was airplanes. They could spot them. They could spot a submarine. They could track it. They could bomb it. And with World War II aviation technology, the planes out of the eastbound convoys with all the materials, the planes out of Canada and particularly Newfoundland could only go so far into the Atlantic, and the planes out of the UK should only go so far. And there was a gap, an air gap in the middle, and it took about 3 days to cross it. And that's where the U-boats attacked. All right. Another movie recommendation is on Apple, Greyhound. How many people seen Greyhound? You may have seen Greyhound. Highly recommend it. It's stars Tom Hanks. He's a destroyer captain who's commander of the protection force of a convoy. And it's based on a book named The Good Shepherd, which I also read after watching the movie, which really shows the struggles at the time as we were ramping up with protecting the ships. Needless to say, with Tom Hanks, and he did it with Steven Spielberg. So this is the same production group that brought you Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers, and the Pacific, and it's just as well done. And by the way, they did Masters of the Air too. So how do you fill that gap? Well, they came up with a ship called an escort carrier. Now, an escort carrier, unlike the big fleet attack carriers that led the charge across the Pacific, they were small. They were built on large cargo ship hulls. So these hulls were being built anyway. Put a flat top on it. You got a special purpose ship. And they only carried one type of airplane. They carried Grumman Wildcat fighters. The Wildcat was the Navy's primary carrier-borne fighter at the start of World War II. However, it was no match for the Japanese Zeros. So they developed the Hellcat, which was superior and could fight the Zeros. And so they had these Wildcats left over, and they were perfect for this because they could land on a carrier deck. They had a good range, and they could carry a bomb. So these things, through the middle of the gap, they'd take off, they'd fly around, look for U-boats, spotted one, drop a bomb on them and everything. And that had a lot to do with those losses in May of 1943, where they said, okay, the mid-Atlantic doesn't work. And I didn't mention it on the previous side, but 1942, when the U-boats were having a field day, the U-boat captains and crews called that the happy times. So let's talk about technology. Now we're going to go back to last year. Who can tell me what that is? Who was here last year? Yeah.
An Enigma machine.
It's an Enigma machine, right? Which was a commercial coding machine developed in Germany before the war. It was adapted by the German military. They enhanced it. The way they worked was no secret. The mathematics was no secret. Problem is the coding had millions and millions of permutations. And if you could figure out what the message, if you had a few key words, you could figure out what the message was. Only problem is it take mathematicians months to do one day. And that's not very good for intelligence. So specifically for the purpose of breaking the German naval code, like the U-boats, the British started the Bletchley Park code breakers, led by Alan Turing, a mathematician from Cambridge. and a bunch of his other smart buddies. And they developed, they called it the bomb. This was a mechanical digital computer, and it could decipher the code in several hours. So every day they would get messages. The Germans had a habit of starting certain messages the same way all the time. So they knew what the keywords. So once you have some words, you can put it in here. All right. And this was one of the best kept secrets of World War II. In fact, it was like the 50s before anybody did. The reason for that is because they never told the Russians about it. And at the end of the war, the Russians seized all the Enigma machines they could do, and they started using it for their military codes, not knowing that the US and the UK could decipher. This eventually evolved into an electronic version, which is now acknowledged as the first digital computer. It wasn't for many years because people didn't know it existed. The next breakthrough was this little guy, resonant cavity magnetron. I'm not going to give you a scientific explanation because I don't understand it, but I'll tell you this. Up until this was invented, radar was a big structure, multi-story structure, with huge things and all. This allowed radar to be miniaturized enough to put it on a ship in a year. And then last, the Hedgehog. So traditionally, when you want to sink a submarine, you drop depth charges on it. And they're set to go off at a certain depth. You drop them where you think you'll get it close. And the idea is it isn't to explode next to it, it's to create a shock wave close enough to the submarine to damage it or sink it. Very hit and miss. The success rate of the attacks is something like 1 in 16. Hedgehog, these are those little pointy things on the end of those. The cylinder is an explosive charge. The little pointy things are contact detonators. So when it hits something, it explodes. And they fire a big pattern in these things, and they'd sink down. And if one hit a U-boat, it didn't take a big charge to blow a hole in a submarine's hull, in one hole, and they're done. So, and the success rate with those was something like 1 in 6, so it's 10 times better. All right, that was your review, or new knowledge, depending on whether you were here last year. So let's come to the U-505. It was a Class 9 long-range U-boat built for long-range operations, 251 feet long, 22 feet wide, but the pressure hull was 14 feet wide. So World War II, and I think modern submarines are the same thing. The essence of a submarine, and by the way, I'll talk about modeling that. In a submarine, you have this cylinder, which is what keeps the pressure, and everything else is attached to it. Okay, so you think about 14 feet, that's, maybe, I don't know, maybe something like that. That's not very wide. And you got to get a lot of people and a lot of stuff in this tube. Okay, so this says crew of 56, but for some reason on its last voyage, the U-505 had 59. They had 6 torpedo tubes, 2 forward, 4 forward, 2 aft. One of my retirement hobbies is building ship and car models, and this is a model of it's a generic model of a Class 9 U-boat, but I left stuff off of it because along the way they kept taking more and more stuff off, particularly deck guns. The start of the war, if submarines had deck guns, the idea was if you found an isolated merchant ship, nobody else was around, you could surface and sink it with your gun and save valuable torpedoes. As the war progressed, particularly from 1943 on, that just was not practical, so they quit putting them on there. So the model has holes for the deck guns, but I didn't put them on there because this is as close a representation of U-505 as I could create. And it was finished at 10 p.m. last time. Okay, let's talk about their war patrols and their reputation.
Herbert?
Yes.
What's it made of? Clay or wood or?
Plastic. It's just a plastic kit. I just build plastic models.
Oh, I see.
So and it's the model companies, I think that's Revell. I use several. They have what they call adult level kits, and this is adult. It's a level 4, which means it's not for kids. And I paint it. I mean, everything on there is painted. That was my boyhood hobby, and I guess the older you get, the more you revert to the past. But anyway, it's great. I enjoy it. Create interesting things and uses my hands and cognitive abilities and all that. I don't think I have to tell most people in the room why that's important. So, all right. So, career of 505. Their first war patrol, they left Kiel, Germany, where the sub was built. They, after work up and training and all, and they went out through the Baltic and up around the north of England and to their base in Lorraine, France. They were armed and ready to fight, but they encountered no merchant ships and they weren't attacked. The second war patrol, which was their most successful, they were sent off the coast of Africa and they sank 4 ships, totaling about 25,000 tons. The third war patrol, they were sent to the Caribbean. They sank 2 ships. Unfortunately, one of them was a Colombian ship, which was a neutral nation, and it was carrying a Colombian diplomat, and it resulted in Colombia declaring war on Germany. So I'm not sure how much that mattered. But, the third patrol, back to the Caribbean, they sank 1 ship, and then they were attacked by a British Lancaster bomber, 1 pilot, out of Trinidad, who landed a 250-pound bomb on the deck of the sub, which came close to sinking it. The explosion of the bomb caused the plane to crash and killed the pilot. So they didn't know if he had radioed their position or not. It turns out he probably didn't, because they spent 2 weeks repairing it and limped all the way back to Lorraine. Along the way, they built met a supply submarine. They had these big submarines that were just supplies to U-boats in action. They're called milch cows, which is German for milk cow. So they met them somewhere along the way, unloaded, wounded, got parts and all that, and they made it back. So they had the distinction of being the most damaged U-boat to ever survive and get back to port. Okay. So far they've caused a neutral nation to declare war on Germany, and they've been the most damaged. So patrols 5 through 9 were every one of them was dismal for various reasons. Sometimes they went out, they were immediately attacked before they got very far, had to come back. Sometimes they had mechanical failures. The French yard workers would do things like screw with the electronics on the sub, or drill a hole in a fuel tank, stuff like that. They had what's in 5, 6, 8. 4 patrols were just one catastrophe after another, accomplished nothing. Their 10th war patrol, their most infamous, after 10 months of repairs, they went out, they were attacked near the Azores. They were under severe depth charge attack. And the U-boat captains each had under lock and key a revolver, a handgun, a German Luger. And they were authorized, if a crew member panicked, just shoot them, bang, because that would restore order. Okay, and if you've seen Das Boot, that the old grizzled old engineer is a veteran. He finally loses it, and the captain's getting ready to shoot him, and then he kind of gets it together. Well, in this case, the captain got out the gun, put it to his head, and shot himself. Not a big morale builder. Fortunately, the first officer restored calm, kept things going, and they survived the attack. But he's the only submarine commander in any service in World War II to commit suicide in action. So their 11th patrol, they go out and they have to rescue survivors of a torpedo boat and come right back. So once again, they don't get anything done. And then they leave on their 12th patrol to patrol off the coast of Africa. Now, by 1944, getting so many ships across the Atlantic, which was essential for D-Day, and the reduction of submarine activity, you now had these escort carriers available to form hunter-killer groups. So they would take a carrier with 6 destroyers or destroyer escorts, and they would go looking, instead of being defensive, they would go looking for subs to attack. Now, keep in mind, the Allies had broken the naval code, and the great weakness of the U-boats was that Dönitz commanded all their actions, and it was all sent by radio. So from about 43 on, the Allies had a pretty good idea where they were and what they were up to. So they knew there was a U-boat operating off the coast of North Africa, which is a shipping crossroads. It's ships coming around the Cape of Africa and going up, ships coming out of the Mediterranean in and out, all in that area. So on May 15th, 1944, Task Force 22.3 left Norfolk, Virginia, under the command of Captain Dan Gallery, to go and hunt a U-boat thought to be operating off the coast of North Africa. Gallery had been involved in sinking other U-boats, and he'd noticed that sometimes if they come to the surface and the crew evacuates, they don't sink that fast. So he came up with the idea of, I wonder if we could board one of these things and capture it. And he got, by his immediate superiors, he got it approved to pursue that. So on the way over, he trained a crew on one of the destroyers to get in a whaleboat quickly, go to a sub, get off. Different people that have different responsibilities. So, they searched and searched. They could not find a U-boat, so he decides we better go to Casablanca and get fuel, because by that time that was in Allied hands. And just as they were starting to pull away, the destroyer Chantilly reported a sonar contact. It was a U-505. They immediately, with a couple of their buddies, they moved into attack. They fired a Hedgehog volley. It missed, but they depth charged it, and they forced the sub to the surface. These are actual pictures, by the way, because Gallery wanted a photo record of what they were doing. So this was all, that's the real attack on 505, that in the stock photo, okay? So now here's one brave bunch of dudes. This is the volunteers who volunteered to board a sinking submarine and try to capture it. It was led by Lieutenant J.G. Albert David. That is the second lowest rank in the Navy. It's ensign, and it's Lieutenant J.G. Translation, he's expendable. But anyway, so they were ready to go, and so they went and they boarded the submarine, and they had several priorities as soon as they would get on. One was to disconnect scuttle charges. The German submarines had explosive charges that the crew was supposed to set before they left, and if one of them went off, the submarine would sink. So let's find those and cut the wires to them. Close any valves. In the meantime, scoop up charge code books and papers as quickly as possible. So if you have to leave in a hurry, you got some really good stuff. Now, let's just stop and imagine for a minute what these guys are doing. You got this submarine that's sinking. It's like half sunk. You're going to get on it and go through one hatch into a dark environment, which you have a vague idea of where stuff is based on U.S. submarines, but you don't know. You don't know if somebody's down there who wants to die for the fatherland, all right? And it's filling up with water. And by the way, a scuttle charge might go off at any minute. Thing would sink. And you know, if it starts going down, you're not getting off. Okay. I think it was one of the most courageous acts of World War II for those guys to get on that. So here's the first interesting thing. Oh shoot, the picture you can't see. Well, that little curve at the bottom is a lid that fits on this thing. Okay, that's called a sea strainer, and the submarines had valves they could open to flood the boat. But as a safety precaution, they had this thing called a sea strainer, where they went into this pipe, and it had a secure top on it, so that if one of those things got open by accident, it wouldn't sink the boat. Okay, so when the crew evacuates, somebody has a responsibility of taking the lid off this thing so the boat floats. So one of the sailors comes on this thing, and this water's coming out, and he sees this lid that says, "Huh." Well, oh, another part of the story. Whoever takes this off, it's their responsibility to carry the thing topside and drop it over. Now that's heavy. And I think whoever removed it decided they were more interested in saving their butt than carrying this thing up a ladder. Okay. So anyway, this U.S. sailor said, "Oh, that looked like it fits on there," puts it on there, screws it down, and it quits the boat. And then they ran around and as many scuttle charges as they could find. They yanked the wires and all, but they didn't know if they had them all. All right. So the next thing that happened was there's them finally securing it. So Gallery notifies the chain of command that he's captured the U-boat. The higher ups, Admiral Kincaid, who is chief of naval operations, was absolutely furious. He wanted anybody that had anything to do with this thing court-martial. Okay. Anybody know why? Right. This happened on June 4th, 1944. What happened in that time frame?
D-Day.
D-Day happened 2 days later. Yeah. And they were terrified that if the Germans knew that a submarine had been captured, they would immediately change all their codes. Oh, wow. Which would take a little bit of time to sort out. Okay. But so they said, you can't take it to Casablanca, which was nearby. It's crawling with German spies. So take it to Bermuda, because you know it's a British enclave in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Well, that's all well and good, except for it's about 2,500 miles from where they are. Okay, so but they did want to save it. They wanted to study the military secrets and all. It was the longest tow of the war. The challenge of the tow was it's half full of water. The rudder was stuck in a certain position. So you know, if you're pulling something, I've pulled boats before, you know, it's not straight, it's going to keep. Anyway, but here's Gallery points out who the real hero was. I'm just going to read it to you. It was touch and go whether the sub would remain afloat. Commander Earl Tocino spent hours down in the bilges, crawling around in oily water under the engines, tracing pipelines, closing valves to make sure the boat was watertight. He risked his life many times by squirming in inaccessible corners under the floor plates, where he wouldn't have a chance to escape in the case the sub started to sink. thanks to his uncanny instinct for finding the right valves and his total disregard for his own safety, we succeeded in saving the U-505. So what about the crew? Well, obviously they became POWs. They were, went to Bermuda with everybody else, and then they were sent to a prison camp in Louisiana, and they were held incommunicado, which is a violation of the Geneva Convention. They let everybody in Germany think the boat was lost and they were dead. All right, because they didn't want the Germans to know we captured the boat. They were at Camp Ruston. They were isolated from other prisoners, and they, interesting enough, they tried to get the word out. This is one of my favorites. They made several attempts. One night they created balloons out of cellophane bags that they filled with hydrogen gas, which they produced by mixing cleaning chemicals. They decorated with the balloon with iron crosses and U-505 lives and released them in the air and watched them go over the perimeter fence. And I guess they ended up, some Louisianans ended up with some interesting souvenirs. I don't think they didn't get to Germany. They were released at the end of the war, repatriated, and returned home in 1947. Oh, wait, now I'm going to take it diversion for a minute. I saw a really interesting show on History Channel, or one of those shows, about the German POWs that were held in the U.S. And most of them were captured in the North African campaigns, because once we got into Europe, they could have POW camps in Europe. A lot of them were, first of all, they knew they couldn't escape. I mean, where are you going to go here? There's a big ocean, two big oceans. And a lot of them were sent to work, released during the day, work for local farms. And the farmers reported that they're polite, they work hard, and they're very diligent. They're Germans. So anyway, the point of the story is a fairly high percentage of them, about 30%, when the war ended, if they didn't have anybody to go back to, they stayed and became naturalized U.S. citizens. Some of them went back, gathered up their families, wives, girlfriends, and all, came back, became U.S. citizens, and were generally very productive citizens. So they, in other words, they fell in love with our country, while they were being held captive here. I think that's a great story. Yes.
When we boarded the submarine, did the crew have any resistance?
No, they were already off.
Okay.
There were 59 crew members on. One was killed during the attack. The others hit the water. And one of the other destroyers launched whaleboats to go pick them all up. So there was no resistance. By that point in the war, not surprisingly, morale was pretty low in the U-boats. And I think it was starting to dawn on a lot of Germans that maybe we're not going to win this war. So they weren't ready to die for the fatherland, in a useless sacrifice. All right. So after the war, all the captured submarines and surrendered submarines, they were used either for training ships or target practice. And they did obviously finally reveal that the U-boats that they had captured 505. Which is one other thing on POWs I think is interesting. Before they repatriated, they were made to watch films of the Holocaust camps, because they wanted the next generation of German leadership to understand what happened. And 99.9% of them were appalled. This must be propaganda. Our nation could not have done this. Yeah, it did. So anyway, so in in the early, actually it was, I forgot the date. Anyway, not too long after the war, they were done with this. They were going to scrap it or use it for target practice or something. Well, it turns out that Captain Gowrie, who's now an admiral, was a native of Chicago. And he said, this U-boat and the capture of it is an important part of our history. And I want it in my hometown. So he campaigned and got organized and all and arranged for it to be taken over by the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. It was currently in Norfolk, Virginia. This thing weighs 1,100 tons. You don't just put it on a truck and carry it to Chicago. So they built a special barge and they floated it up to down the St. Lawrence Freeway through the Seaway, through the Great Lakes and everything to Chicago. And they set it out at the back door of the museum. And the first time I visited U505, which was in the mid-'80s, that's where it was. And they cut a hole in the side so you could get up in it. It was about 90, it was about a 90-degree summer day. And you didn't want to spend a lot of time in it. You're in a steel tube. It's like an oven.
Yeah.
And my then wife just was not into it. But anyway, got to see it, you know. So, and that was 1954. Let me put it there. So it's sitting outside in Chicago. That winter's in it. It's really starting to deteriorate. And it dawned on more and more people, this is a real treasure. So the museum raised $35 million to build an indoor exhibit hall. And it's off the back of the building, pretty much where it's sitting now. And it's, I'll talk more about the exhibit hall in a minute. But for those of you who don't know me, I spent my life in construction, so anything construction sounds interesting. So getting this thing into the new space was, you know, quite an engineering feat. And I'll leave it at that. The current exhibit, oops, what's that in there twice? Okay. This structure is a simulated World War II U-boat pin. So they built these concrete pins that were impervious to bombing, and the U-boats would come back and they would go in them and they could work on them, resupply them and everything. It had 22 feet of concrete on it. If you watch Masters of the Air or read the book, both, they bomb these things continuously. Never, you know, the bombs would just bounce off. Anyway, so this is like, you know, a U-boat pin. All kinds of exhibits around it. And once again, they have a hole on the side you can go in it. So I'll quit backing up here. So when you go in it, the first thing that strikes you is there are pipes and valves and handles and gauges just everywhere, all over this thing. A submarine is a very complicated mechanical device. In this era, it only been developed over 50 years. So a lot of things were manual. You know, these nuclear submarines, I'm sure a lot of it's computer operated, but you got to turn a crank to get it to do something. And if you want to make it dive, you know, 5 or 6 people have to turn different things different ways all at the same time. But it's also very crowded. these are the two diesel engines that operated it on the surface underwater. It ran on electric motors that ran on batteries that were underneath in the bottom of the sub. That's the forward torpedo room.
Yeah.
This was not funded. Okay. You can see that their bunks, you know, wherever they could have a bunk, they had a bunk. They would do what's called hot bunks. Everybody on the ship except for the captain shared their bunk with somebody else. So you got up, you went on duty, somebody else came in and got in the same bunk and went to sleep. Okay.
Yeah.
There was one head, if you don't know, on a boat, you call the bathroom the head. One small head with one toilet. Or to be sure, about 59 of your closest friends. And Das Boot does a good job of showing this at the start of the voyage. They would have food. They'd have sausages and hams and all kinds of stuff hanging from pipes and all over the boat, okay, because there wasn't a lot of storage space. And they do have an exhibit off the thing, the galley, as they call vacation on the boat. It's about the size of, you know, a little bit bigger than this square right here. Okay. And the cook fixed 3 meals a day for 59 people in that space with one stove.
Wow.
All right. And then this is one of my favorite quotes from a crew member. That's
You tell my wife how lucky she is.
back to all right. I love this quote. It said, crew member said, the boat had a delightful aroma of diesel fuel, sauerkraut, and sweat. And you're gonna live in this thing for maybe a couple months. Anyway, and you'll notice also, you know, the other thing they stored wherever they could were torpedoes. So, you know, that's not just sitting there that's where they stored it until they needed it. So here's my closing thought. I think the U-505 is the lucky U-boat. Now it's war record, and if you served on it, you were unlucky. But as a object itself, it's one of only 4 surviving World War II U-boats. Wow. And it's the only one that's in a special purpose, indoors, in a special purpose museum exhibit. How lucky could it get?
Yeah.
All right, that's my presentation. Any questions or comments? We got a couple minutes. Yeah.
Where are the other 3?
2 are in Germany. One is an outdoor war memorial. The other is in a museum. And the other is an outdoor memorial at Liverpool, where a lot of the convoys came. Yeah.
How many torpedoes did the boat carry?
I think let's see, they had 6 in the tubes and I think like 10 reloads or something. Some of the boats would have an exterior compartment where they could store extra torpedoes if they were really going for a while. I'm not sure how safe that is in a depth charge attack, but anyway, so yeah, I mean they would chock these things full of food. So usually the greatest limiter, if you were having a successful patrol, was the number of torpedoes. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Do you know if they ever got anything of value off the boat?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, the code books, the current code books are valuable. They were dying to get, they thought the U-boats had superior technology to the Allied submarines, and they discovered they did not. Now confirming a negative is valued. Okay, so, but yeah, that's a good question. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I just wanted to comment that in the logbook, the first entry is remember the motto, always in the lead. Just for what it's worth.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, Dave.
It seems to me it would be, it would be hard to resupply torpedoes to a submarine. You don't just pull into port and.
Well, the big milch cow resupply submarine, they actually carry torpedoes too. So they would have food and that kind of, you know, sustenance, and they would have torpedoes.
So they could have out in the ocean,
Yes.
resupply them?
Yes,
Wow.
and fuel too. They could load fuel. So. Yes, sir.
My uncle managed a farm outside of Allentown, and during World War II, they had a number of German POWs that worked the farm.
Interesting.
Kind of interesting.
Yeah, and the farm families of technology worked hard. They kind of adopted them. You know, after they got used to them and saw they were good people and all, they would like ask them to stay for dinner and stuff like that. They really became, you know, kind of almost like family members. So. Yes, sir.
You say have one bathroom on there?
Yeah.
With all that food?
Yep. Sausage, sauerkraut.
I love that you shared that they had to watch the Holocaust film. What's surprising to me, I guess, is that they did not know any of that. I mean, how did they not know any of that was going on?
Well, those camps were pretty self-contained. And I think people in villages around them had a notion that something good wasn't going on. But the Allies had an inkling.
Yeah.
But they were really, you know, deep in Germany and occupied territory of Poland.
Yeah.
Czechoslovakia and all that. And so it really wasn't until they were liberated that they realized the full extent of it.
Yeah.
And interestingly, in reading the Masters of the Air book, the World War II bombers, this could be a whole presentation, but I'll tell you, there was a lot of discussion of the ethics of bombing, particularly killing civilians.
Yeah.
The British thought a dead German's a good German. If we kill somebody, it's good. The Americans were more, you know, we want to attack military targets and all that. So after the war, this guy who was a bomber pilot and a commander of a wing eventually, he was feeling guilty, and he visited the Bergen-Law, or Bergen, however you pronounce it, concentration camp. He walked out and he said, "I no longer feel any guilt about anything I did during the war."
Herb?
Yes.
May I comment from Arkansas? Where
Yes.
I'm watching you. Thank you for the presentation. I grew up in Chicago, had many opportunities to tour the U-505. It's a moving experience. My father was an officer in the Navy during the war. He never talked about the war except on one occasion. And that was after we visited the U-505 and took a tour. He got very emotional. We sat down for lunch. And he told me about his experience of the capture of the U-505. He was not directly involved with the capture, but he was sharing bunks and staterooms with some of the men you mentioned today. That's the only time my father talked about the war. And it must have been quite a thing to be present at that point in time. The other comment I would like to make is I had a client in Wilhelmshaven, Germany, and that's another site where U-boats were built. The plant is now converted into making high aerial work platforms, forklifts, if you will. But the layout of the plant was very interesting. It was linear, And the last building ended at the North Sea, where they just pushed the U-boats out into the water. And I knew that was a plant where U-boats had been built, but the current Germans who work there would absolutely deny U-boats were ever built there. There was a certain guilt about that. And I would say, well, it's strange that the plant layout ends at the sea. I said, well, that's just how things were done in the 40s. So those are my 2 comments from here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. That's interesting. Yes, Dave.
I mean, it was an amazing degree of danger that these men boarded the boat that was sinking.
Yeah.
Did they ever get recognized congressionally?
I'm sure they got some recognition. I actually meant to look that up before, and it got by me, but that's a good question. I'm sure they got some kind of recognition. They did not get a Medal of Honor.
I realize now why, while they were the commander-in-chief wanted to, what'd you say, discipline everybody? Because the risk of the Germans suddenly changing their code was worse than capturing the U-boat.
All right, well, I think that's all our time. So once again, thank you for
Herb,
coming.
thank you again. Thank you much. Always a pleasure to have you educate us on a piece of history that we may have heard about, but don't know much about.
Right.
So, thank you, and you're always welcome to do another one.
Well, I will.
Maybe Masters of the Air or something.
Well, that's coming up, but I will. Dave and I were talking beforehand. The first one of these I did it during the pandemic, and I did it online, and there weren't participants. But I took an extensive Normandy D-Day tour, and I shared that experience, and we're thinking we'll recycle that.
All right.
So, but Masters of the Air is coming up in the future.
All right.
All right. And I'm not going to rush out. So if you want to come up and look at the submarine or anything, thank you.
And remember, we got a couple more, and remember, sign up for the May 14th. Give Dave a nod. If you don't have your money today, give him an indication of intent.
One, a bad back to this day plagues me. And I was in the first draft lottery. I had a high number. How about you?
I have I tried I tried to fake it in the name of it. I had to get the hearing test.
I like your hat. And you're brave to wear it to church.
Okay, how is it available?
I don't feel like
I was president.
I think.
there's more on leaves now.
Yeah. Oh, don't even. Well, my partner, Pam, we just adults. Hard money, paid it back. Good to see you, Dan.